Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. For those of you who come from elsewhere, my name is Catherine Mooney, and I focus a lot of my research and much of my teaching on saints, which we're going to hear about tonight. So if you've ever heard an intriguing story about a saint, or maybe some memorable anecdote that was thought-provoking or, exciting somehow, or maybe you've heard some feat that was so fantastic and far-fetched, you thought it can't be possible what they're saying about this saint. I think our presenter is going to talk a little bit about the impossible later on. Well, if you've heard anything at all really about a saint, you probably have a debt of gratitude to pay to the Bollandists. And yet, interestingly, very few people have heard of the Society of Bollandists. So let me just tell you a few things about them. They were founded in the early 1600s by a Flemish Jesuit who had noted when he was reading manuscripts about the lives of the saints that they didn't all agree, that lives written about the same saint, but by different authors, would convey a different set of facts or interpretations. And he thought, well, this doesn't make sense. We should collect all of these manuscripts. We should compare them in a scholarly fashion in good Jesuit style. And we should figure out which texts get us closer to the person that we can know about who lived at some point, and which stories have some embellishments or pious fictions or inventions. So he was going to scour all the libraries to do that. And soon he and this project was joined by another Flemish Jesuit, Jean Bolland, and it's from him that we get the name, the Society of Bollandists. And initially, these early Jesuits thought that they were going to finish this project in a few years. That was over 400 years ago, and they are still working at this project. They're still publishing critical studies of saints and their cults. We really owe it to the Society of Bollandists and the Jesuits for the critical study of saints and their cults. And one thing that they did, aside from trying to straighten out, to the extent that it's possible, claims made about certain individuals and what might perhaps be verifiable from multiple documents about the saints, they weren't just trying to get to the real story, to throw out the fake stories. They understood very well that the later interpretations of saints, even if it changed their stories to some extent, opened windows into the cultures and the attitudes and belief systems of the authors who wrote those later stories of the saints. So they weren't going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They cover all of this history of a saint, even if someone like St. Francis, about whom probably a few thousand biographies have been written, even if the saint has multiple saints' lives. It's been mostly, I think, very austere work by very dedicated scholars who spend hundreds or thousands of hours learning the languages they need, Latin, Greek, Syriac, whatever, learning how to read manuscripts with different scripts. And over all these years, they have had an output of hundreds and hundreds of volumes. So most scholars who are studying the saints still often have recourse to the Acta Sanctorum, a multi-volume set of texts by and about the saints that is now accessible digitally. In addition, they have published a journal about saints that's thriving. They have a collection of manuscripts and many artifacts about the saints, reliquaries, holy cards, things like that. And they have, over the last 400 years, amassed a library of over 500,000 books about the saints. So we hear about the saints in TVs, movies, homilies, classrooms, and yet we don't know about this group that has been flying under the radar for so many centuries. It's an expensive endeavor, and they need our help. So if any of you are interested in helping the Bollandists out to support this project, it's well worth it. Someone once pointed out that the Christian tradition is more expansive than its dogmas alone. Sometimes when we think of the tradition, we think of ideas or notions or concepts that need to be defended. But saints themselves, in a way, represent the tradition in a very personalized fashion. So tonight we're going to hear from a very well-known historian, Carlos Eire, who will be introduced, who's going to tell us about how the Bollandists have helped him in his own research.
Being the middle talk is like giving a homily when people know there's lunch waiting. So I'm going to be very brief in introducing Professor Eire. So he's the T. Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. He's a distinguished historian specializing in the late medieval and early modern periods. And with an impressive repertoire of publications, he's illuminated our understanding of this crucial epoch. His book, Reformations, Early Modern Europe, 1450 to 1700, stands as a beacon of excellence and has received numerous accolades, including the esteemed R.R. Hawkins Award for the best book and the American Publishers Awards for professional and scholarly excellence of 2017. Educated within the Jesuit tradition at Loyola Chicago, he was introduced to the scholarly world of the Bollandists at an early stage of his academic life, highlighting his unwavering commitment to learning, research, and intellectual exploration. His latest book, They Flew, A History of the Impossible, has just come out from Yale. That's right. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eire to Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry as he shares his insights and wisdom with us this evening.
Thank you, Father Steve, and thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to the Jesuit community here at Boston College for hosting the event. I'm so glad that all of you are here, especially on a rainy, nasty night like tonight. Is this loud enough?
You're fine with the mic, but this computer, on the other hand.
Ah. There we go.
I want to prevent it from doing that again.
Well, I think if I keep hitting the keys, it'll probably be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Okay. So you've heard the Bollandists have helped me a lot. Yes, they have. Directly and indirectly. And tonight's talk is about one aspect of the work done by the Bollandists and sorting through the lives of the saints. We'll get to a point in the lecture where culture shifts within Catholicism as well as secular culture, where the emphasis begins to be placed on heroic virtue rather than miracles in the lives of the saints from the 18th century. But the Bollandists never shied away from the miracles, and even from impossible miracles, which is why I think they can justly be called historians of the impossible. I'm trying to create this field of history of the impossible. So the Bollandists are right there at the forefront and should be in the forefront. And of course, what you have before you here is a text from the Acta Sanctorum and an image from a graphic hagiography of St. Ignatius Loyola. He had 3 graphic hagiographies as a genre of hagiography that became very popular as naturally after the invention of printing, but in the 16th and 17th century was immensely popular. And St. Ignatius had 3. And this is from this is from the earliest one from 1609. But this text from the Acta Sanctorum, he was observed many times at night, his room filled with a bright light, and he was seen raised up in the air with his knees bent, weeping and sighing and saying, "My God, how infinitely good you are. You even put up with those who are evil and perverse, which is what I am." Probably thinking of his youth, earlier days, no doubt. A little bit more about the Bollandists, because they appear at a very specific time in a very specific place. And what I'm trying to do here at the very beginning is to set them time and place and why the Bollandists emerged, where they did, and why they did. So here's the first Jesuit who embarks on this task of sorting through the lives of the saints, as you just heard. Eire Rosweida, 1569 to 1629. And this right there, that text, that title page, is from his proposal for this project, the Facie Sanctorum Quorum Vitae. Eventually, he would go on to produce and was able to produce 10 volumes of the lives of the Desert Fathers. And then he passed away before any more work could be done. But by then, he'd already had a response from one of the leading Jesuits of the age, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who, when shown that proposal, said, this man counts then on living 200 years longer. But he did not. Followed by Jean Bolland, 1596 to 1665. And there you have the title page of the very first volume of the Acta Sanctorum, which is, I should add at this point, it's very important, closely linked to liturgical life, because the volumes and the lives of the saints are paced according to the liturgical calendar. So here, the first volume, very first volume, is January, right? And then you have several volumes for January, according to the dates when the feasts are celebrated. Very interesting way of organizing the lives of the saints. Scholars wouldn't do this. Secular scholars, I mean. This is very much a church project and very much a Jesuit project. Bolland is followed by Godfrey Hinschen and Daniel van Papenbroek. You can see their dates. We're going now into the 18th century. This project picks up steam, and there you have the title page for second volume of April, which has both of their names on the title page as editors. And they, of course, have others working with them, sorting through all of these manuscripts and also sorting then, but certainly printed texts. Let's back up a bit. Why is it that they appear when they do? And it has everything to do with the cultural effervescence of the Renaissance, which, as everyone knows, epicenter was Florence in Italy. Renaissance humanism, the battle cry, ad fontes, let's return to the sources. Everything of value is in the sources. And basically the Renaissance humanists invented the Middle Ages as the middle period between what? Classical antiquity and the rebirth of classical antiquity in secular terms. In religious terms, the early church and the rebirth of a more vibrant simulacrum of the early church. And in Florence, you find humanists such as Lorenzo Valla, my hero, should be the hero of anyone who studies history or does history, who began to apply not just rationalism, but also philological empiricism to the study of texts. What do I mean by that? It means that you take into consideration the language, the syntax, the vocabulary, the things that are mentioned in a text to see if it can be dated correctly. Because as there were many kind of discrepancies in the lives of the saints, there were many discrepancies in all sorts of aspects of church life, including this document, the Donation of Constantine, which claimed to be from the 4th century, claimed to have been written by the Emperor Constantine, granting rulership of central Italy to the Bishop of Rome. Valla dared to challenge the dating and the authorship, and did so very successfully. And with considerable amount of humor and kind of acid humor. What shall I censure the more? The stupidity of the ideas or of the words? This terrible threat made by Constantine, is the usual one, not of a secular ruler, but of the earthly priests and flamens, and nowadays of ecclesiastics. And so this is not the utterance of a Constantine, but of some fool of a priest who, stuffed and pudgy, knew neither what to say nor how to say it, and gorged with eating and heated with wine, belched out these wordy sentences which convey nothing to another, but turn the author against himself. The Pope himself is the focus of this debunking. You would think Valla would get into trouble, but he was made papal secretary. So much for that sort of, church versus secular culture conflict kind of stuff. He also dared to challenge the dating of one of the most important figures throughout the Middle Ages, Dionysius the Areopagite, who was believed to be from the 1st century. It's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul converts a certain Dionysius. And everyone throughout the Middle Ages had assumed, yes, this is 1st century. This is as old as the New Testament texts. And I have read this. I cannot back it up because I'm not doing that research. But book cited most often throughout the Middle Ages, of course, it's the Bible. Second author, St. Augustine. Third, Dionysius the Areopagite. And Valla unmasks him correctly as possibly 6th century, not 1st century. It didn't lessen the significance of Dionysius, interestingly enough, but this is the kind of philological empiricism that was afoot in the Renaissance. Oh, he also worked on the New Testament, which brings us to perhaps the best known of the Renaissance humanists outside of Italy, Erasmus of Rotterdam, from the Low Countries. In 1516, he publishes his New Testament, which applied philological empiricism, searching through manuscripts, Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. He selects what he thinks is the text that is possibly closest to the original text of the Greek. And then he dares to challenge that, to challenge the Latin translation of Jerome, the Vulgate translation, and come up with his own translation in Latin of the New Testament. Erasmus was offered positions by every major university in Europe and turned them all down. And he was one of the first authors to the invention of the printing press who was able to live from his publications, and also was very adept at mooching off other people and finding patrons. But as all of this is happening, this philological empiricism, along comes the Protestant Reformation. That changes everything for those who, like Erasmus, remained Catholic. This is a late 16th century image of the major Protestant reformers attempting and failing to destroy the church, the Catholic Church. But destruction was not just metaphorical, and especially in the Low Countries. The war against the saints takes a very, very, very intense turn. Now, the major Protestant reformers had swept away the concept of veneration of the saints, the intercession of the saints. And again, they're on a spectrum from less radical to more radical. Some of the Protestant reformers claim that not only should we do away with the cult of the saints, as they called it, veneration of the saints, but images of the saints. Have no images. It's one of the 10 commandments. So the war against the idols is also a war against the saints. And in 1566, and here we see, this is an engraving of Dutch iconoclasts destroying images. And over on the other side of the engraving, you see, of course, Roman Catholic clergy worshiping the whore of Babylon, upon which the Pope sits. This is very, very virulent Calvinist anti-Catholicism, anti-papism. In 1566, all hell breaks loose in the Low Countries. Calvinists, who have been receiving missionaries trained in Geneva by John Calvin and his followers, virulent iconoclasts, who want to abolish not only images and the veneration of the saints, but also the celebration of the Mass, because as they like to say, the worst idol of all is the Eucharist, which they like to call the white God or the baked God or the God of paste. Beginning in the southern Netherlands, which were then in the possession of the Spanish Habsburgs, crowds of thousands march from town to town. And here you have all the arrows. Historians have figured out in which direction these iconoclastic mobs travel, destroying every image they can. And the Beeldenstorm, the iconoclastic storm, is also the beginning of a war of rebellion against Spanish Habsburg rule. A war that will last on and off from 1566 until the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and cause great deal of destruction, death, mayhem. And what ends up happening by 1648 is that although the iconoclasm began here in the South and moved up to the North, by the end of this war, Catholics have moved to the South and displaced the Protestants here. So you've got basically a Protestant North and a Catholic South. And in 1648, the Republic of the Netherlands becomes independent. South remains in Habsburg hands. And that is where the Bollandists emerge. No mystery to me why, after all of this, very close to home, this is also supposedly a depiction of what was going on in the southern Netherlands in 1566. It's a big change that takes place. This abolition of the veneration of the saints is also the abolition of the miraculous, because a correlate argument against Catholicism is that there are no miracles being performed by the Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, the argument goes further than that, as we'll see in a minute or two. There haven't been any miracles since around the year 100, with the death of the last of the apostles, the 12 apostles. So this scary looking man, Max Weber, sometimes he appears in my nightmares, argued that the key turning point in the transition to modernity was precisely this: doing away with miracles, doing away with material points of contact with the divine, or as he put it, Entzauberung der Welt. Taking magic out of the world is the correct translation. But most English translations tell you that it's the disenchantment of the world by the Protestant Reformation. Is this true? Did Protestants really disenchant the world? Well, scholars are still arguing about this, and will keep arguing about it till the end of the world, I'm sure. But there is this to be said for Weber's thesis. Luther himself said it very clearly that visible works, and in this case, he was talking about healing miracles mostly. Visible works are simply signs for the ignorant, unbelieving crowd, and for their sakes that are yet to be attracted. But as for us who know already all we do know and believe the gospel, what do we need them for? What do we want them for? John Calvin, next generation, and also Reformed Protestant, a follower of Ulrich Zwingli. We may also fitly remember that Satan has his miracles, which, though they are deceitful tricks rather than true powers, are such a sort as to mislead the simple-minded and untutored. Notice in both of these statements, the put down, very obvious put down, simple-minded people and simple people. Idolatry has been nourished by wonderful miracles, yet these are not sufficient to sanction the superstition either of magicians or idolaters. Calvin's words, correctly translated. This overall argument, known as the cessation of miracles, proposes that after about 100, no such thing as miracles. So what about the miracles claimed by the Catholic Church? Oh, things happen for sure, yes, but they're all demonic tricks, as Calvin said. Demonic tricks. Every miracle claimed by the Catholic Church is either a fraud, an outright fraud, or demonic in origin. And if you're interested, this book by Benjamin Warfield, Counterfeit Miracles, will bring you up to speed on the cessation of miracles argument and its role in the development of Reformed Protestantism. And here's some more John Calvin, talking specifically about healing and how the apostles healed with oil, with chrism. That gift of healing was temporary, all are constrained to affirm, and events clearly prove. Then the sign of it ought not to be deemed perpetual. It hence follows that they who at this day set anointing among the sacraments are not the true followers, but the apes of the apostles, except they seek to restore the effect produced by it, which God has taken away from the world for more than 1400 years. Council of Trent response. Council of Trent met from 1545 to 1563. Most of its important decrees are from the final session, 1563. And I still remember Father John O'Malley's book on Council of Trent, which reads like a mystery novel. Because you're reading along, you say, this is going to be a disaster. Oh my God, what a disaster. This cannot be rescued. And then in the final chapter, wow. 25th session, decree on the invocation, veneration, relics of saints and sacred images. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I just put it up there for you to see where this yellow text is embedded in this much larger defense of the veneration of images and of miracles. It says, it is good and useful suppliantly to invoke them, the saints, and to have recourse to their prayers, aid and help for obtaining benefits from God through his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Christocentric, but yet a defense of the veneration of the saints against those who say it is pure idolatry. More from the Council of Trent. And this is the image, 1619, Peter Paul Rubens, The Miracles of St. Francis Xavier. So 1619, he has been beatified. You can already start to put up paintings. This is from an altarpiece. Emphasis on the role that bishops have in teaching Catholics about the veneration of the saints and the proper veneration of the saints. And again, the embedded text, right? That not only because the people are thereby admonished of the benefits and gifts bestowed upon them by Christ, but also because the miracles which God has performed by means of the saints and their salutary examples are set before the eyes of the faithful, making this a centerpiece of Catholic belief, Catholic teaching, Catholic devotion. And finally, this issue of abuses. This is the correlate, Peter Paul Rubens' painting for this altarpiece, The Miracles of St. Ignatius Loyola. And here it shows him actually exorcising a demon. I don't know if you can see it there. It's very visible. No abuses. What kind of abuses? Moreover, in the invocation of the saints, the veneration of relics, sacred use of images, every superstition must be removed. This is the call to action that the Bollandists follow with the lives of the saints. Remove all the fake stuff, all the superstitious stuff, all the ahistorical stuff. It's not just images that have to be and devotion that have to be cleared of superstition, but also the lives of the saints. And that these things may be more faithfully observed, the Holy Synod ordains no one be allowed to place or cause to be placed any unusual image in any place or church, howsoever exempted, except that image have been approved of by the bishop, that no new miracles are to be acknowledged, nor new relics recognized. And how is this to be done? Well, you consult theologians, you consult other pious men, and they shall act therein as the bishop shall judge to be consonant with truth and piety. Veritas, pietas, truth and piety. But then, Protestantism is only the beginning of something much larger that happens with the passage of time. All right, so the Bollandists have begun their work in the early 1600s, but by the mid 1600s, not only Protestants that the Catholic Church is contending with, but skeptics of all sorts. Baruch Spinoza against miracles, and he had a very logical argument against miracles. Not Protestant at all, just purely logical. The will of God is identical with the laws of nature. Second, miracles, a violation of the laws of nature. Third, necessarily, God's will is inviolable. Fourth, therefore, miracles can't happen. And I didn't make up this image. If you ever have spare time and you wish to do so, just Google any Enlightenment philosopher, his name, and sunglasses. And for some reason, this is a meme that has caught on. I wish I had this talent, or else I'd be doing it for money. Voltaire, more of the same. Long quote, but he's saying basically the same thing as Spinoza. That's what all the Enlightenment philosophers end up saying. You know, if God made rules for the world, why would he undo the rules? That doesn't make any logical sense. This is from the Philosophical Dictionary. And David Hume, who actually had well, Voltaire and Hume both had very good sense of humor. But Hume, in his treatise on miracles, I'm just curious, have any of you at one point been forced to read this treatise on miracles by Hume?
My students read it in Western civilization.
Excellent, excellent. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. The plain consequence is, and it's a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle. unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Pretty biting. But of course, by 1748, right, it's not just Protestants versus Catholics, it's skeptics versus Protestants and Catholics. And the mix, the air we breathe now in 2023 is still pretty much the same air that began to flow back in this time. Miracles are problematic. So what kind of response from the Catholic Church? Well, Augustine plays a huge role in Catholic argumentation against this Enlightenment argument. And you can go back to Augustine, who actually answered a very similar charge from a Manichaean, Faustus, in the early 5th century. There is no impropriety in saying, says Augustine, that God does something against nature when it is contrary to what we know of nature. And here's a very important thread that goes through every Catholic argument in defense of the miraculous, which is that the miraculous might seem to be working against the laws of nature, but it's only because our knowledge of the laws of nature is incomplete. What do we know? What do we know? And our knowledge keeps changing. There's a book by Christopher White, if you're interested in this, that I would like to mention and recommend to you. Christopher White, Other Worlds, an incredible book in which he details how in the 20th century and now in the beginning of the 21st century, there are arguments being made in favor of other dimensions on the basis of science rather than religion. And that some of these arguments in defense of the possible existence of other dimensions gives greater credence to religion. Very interesting how these things evolve. But if you want to consider the work of the Bollandists past the Enlightenment, this man plays a tremendous role, not just with the Bollandists, but Catholicism in general. Prospero Lambertini, who had actually served as the devil's advocate in Rome for many years. The post of the devil's advocate, as you know, is to question the veracity of any miracles proposed for saints, or even to question their virtues. And he had taken this role very seriously, and he's very much an Enlightenment person. And then ends up becoming Pope Benedict XIV. But he wrote this massive De Servorum Dei Beatificatione et Beatorum Canonizatione, which to this day is still largely the rule book for the canonization, beatification of saints, in which he inserted skepticism, empiricism of all sorts. And of course, Bollandists about this time are also taking this extremely seriously. And if you want to read more about this, these two books I highly recommended, both of them, Rationalization of Miracles by Paolo Parigi and Pious Postmortems by Bradford Boulay. Pious Postmortems is not for the squeamish, because it's about autopsies performed on the corpses of saints to look for signs of miraculous changes within their bodies. So, back to the Bollandists. Konrad Janik, 1650 to 1723, edited 12 volumes covering May 5th through July 11th, the Acta Sanctorum. Got in trouble with the Spanish Inquisition. And others opposed to the rigorous scholarly work of the Bollandists, who were now placed in the same rank as all these skeptical troublemakers, especially because of their strict adherence to empirical, philological, and historiographical principles. And the frontispiece of the 1695 June volume tells you what's going on. It looks like an earthquake is taking place. And yes, an earthquake is taking place among the Bollandists in the production of the Acta Sanctorum, because the Spanish Inquisition, led in this charge by the Carmelite order, has attacked the Bollandists. Von Poppenbroek had insisted that the tradition universally received by the Carmelites, which claimed that the order had originated with the Old Testament prophet Elijah, was insufficiently documented. And actually, anytime that you read Teresa Avila or John of the Cross speaking about returning to the ancient rule, this is what they're going back to. They're going back to Mount Carmel. Bollandists challenged this. So, condemnation of the Acta Sanctorum is issued. And in November of 1698, Pope Innocent XII orders an end to the controversy, but the Inquisition keeps receiving denunciations against the Bollandists for all sorts of challenges to established beliefs. And Janek spent almost 3 years in Rome on behalf of the Bollandists. His mission was successful because the Holy See expressed no interest in confirming the Inquisition's accusations. And there you have the document itself against. Look, they're named. The Inquisition of Toledo against the books of these two Bollandists and members of the Society of Jesus. Oh my God. But that's not all. After the suppression of the Society of Jesus in 1773, the work of the Bollandists was continued first at Antwerp and then at Brussels, and finally at Tongerloo, north of Leuven. And in 1794, the French Revolutionary armies invade Belgium. Work had to stop, and worse yet, the Bollandist library was seized and dispersed. But this is the long, long history of the Jesuit suppression. It takes a long time to bounce back. The work was begun again in 1837. And they begin then, early 19th century, with a new focus on bibliographical cataloging of hagiographical texts, not just fixing the texts and discerning what is true and good and not. And in addition, the Analecta Bollandiana was launched, the journal you heard about, which is dedicated to hagiographical historiography. And during this period in the 19th century, the Bollandists owe much to Father Charles de Smet, who you see pictured there. And I don't know if that's the building that you're in now or not. No, it's not. You've moved since then, yeah, okay. So now, bring this to kind of a practical nexus. So, okay, so what are these miracles, all this impossible miracles, especially that the Bollandists engage in, and how they have helped me? I've been working on this subject of impossible miracles for quite some time. And at one talk I gave over a decade ago during the question and answer period, I like when this happens. It wasn't a question, it was a comment. Professor, you're not doing the history of the impossible, you're doing the history of the ridiculous. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Actually, it made me think through what the difference might be between ridiculous and impossible. my project began a little biographical narrative here. Exactly 40 years ago, this past summer, summer of 1983, I was traveling through Spain with a good friend of mine, who at that time was a Dominican priest. And despite the fact that this was a Carmelite convent, he decided to go with me to visit Convent of the Incarnation in Ávila. And we're being shown around by a tour guide with lots of other pilgrims. Here's the kitchen where Teresa cooked. Here's the refectory where all the nuns ate. Food cooked by Saint Teresa. Here's the staircase where Saint Teresa fell and broke her arm. And then we got to the spot where the nuns communicated with the outside world through a grill, known in Spanish as the locutorio. Oh, and here's this spot right here is where Teresa and John of the Cross levitated together for the very first time. Oh, yeah. What's the difference between that and the frying pan and the staircase? Apparently none. It's a fact. It's a fact. So I started working on this. But on the way, I had to figure out how one can write a history of the impossible. And especially I picked two truly impossible miracles. Everyone in this room would agree these two miracles are impossible. There's St. Ignatius again, not just levitating, but glowing. Okay, that's levitation and bilocation. Ah, how does that happen? Here's where the Bollandists come in again. These are not Bollandists, but they relied so heavily on the work of Bollandists. They were my guides through the forest of information, of finding bilocators and levitators. They had called through the Acta Sanctorum. And they were the ones who provided me with a very important list, the list of levitators and bilocators. And here's the hard part of their work. Okay? No computers, no search engines. They're looking through the volumes of the Acta Sanctorum, especially with levitation, looking for a phenomenon that has no name, because levitation is a term not invented till the late 19th century by spiritualists. So they're looking for Latin verbs that refer to elevations of all sorts. And I wish I knew why this happened. Two very different men, Montague Summers and a Jesuit, Herbert Thurston, both published books with identical titles, The Physical Phenomena of Mysticism. In the case of Thurston, you can blame his editors, because this is really a collection of his essays published, not by him, but others. So I think that, well, someone copied someone, but the books are very different. They contain the same information, but they're approached very differently. And then these two men guided this man, Olivier Gilbert-Leroy, who authored book Levitation in 1928, mostly in response to how popular this phenomenon was among spiritualists. And I could find no photo of Leroy, so I thought Magritte would be a good portraitist, for, given the fact that, you know, Bollandists are in Belgium. Levitation can be found throughout Christian history, but really in the first few centuries, it's not very intense. It's kind of hard to find. It's really in the Middle Ages that it starts to take off, no pun intended. And St. Francis, here depicted by Giotto, this is one of the very few medieval depictions of a levitation that I have been able to find. Francis is glowing and floating, just like St. Ignatius. And this is the text is from Bonaventure's Life of Francis, which, by the way, was the life of Francis that the Franciscans only allowed this one to be published. It's the Bollandists who collect all the other lives of Francis and make them known to the world. In 17th century, we begin to see Baroque renditions of medieval levitations. This is St. Francis being stigmatized, and that's St. Anthony of Padua, one of his many encounters with Virgin Mary and the child Jesus. And here you can see a very frightened Brother Leo witnessing this event. This painting hangs in the Louvre. It's immense. It was stolen by Napoleon's soldiers and has yet to be returned. Will probably never be returned. But scholars even disagree on who this floating Franciscan is. But I'm showing this to you because it contains a very important element of modern depictions of levitation. By modern, I'm beginning in the 16th century. The eyewitness. Because all we have, the only fact we have about levitation is the fact that we have testimonies from eyewitnesses. We don't have film of anyone levitating, but we do have plenty of testimonies from eyewitnesses. Who were good levitators? Teresa of Avila, for one, who went up often and is one of the very, very few levitators to actually give you a first-person account of what it feels like to levitate, how much it hurts your body to resist it, and how impossible it is to resist, and how embarrassing it can be. And she begged God to stop it, and according to her, God did stop it for a while, but then a couple more hiccups along the way, including that double levitation with John of the Cross. And here's one account, right? Entering the kitchen, the nuns found her totally elevated and transfixed, face aglow, with a frying pan in her hand, suspended above the flames. She was gripping the frying pan so tightly that it could not be wrested from her hand. And this other passage is about how humble she was and how she didn't like to be seen levitating. And she asked the nuns to hold her down, but they couldn't hold her down. And how she would try to grab onto things, but she would still go up. Very forceful event. Greatest levitator of all time, Franciscan friar Joseph of Cupertino. And one of the worst films ever made, The Reluctant Saint, with Maximilian Schell as Joseph of Cupertino. And forget which actor plays the superior. Oh, Ricardo Montalban. Horrible movie. Anyway. But here he is. He sees the holy house of Loreto. This is towards the end of his life. The Franciscans have to keep moving him to ever more remote locations. And he spends the last 10 years of his life a prisoner in his own cell. He's too much of a distraction. He attracts too many people. So finally, he ends up in Osimo near Loreto, and he sees the holy house, the shrine of the holy house. Up he goes. And he has many triggers. Religious imagery, appropriately, always, almost always sends him into ecstasy and flight. And he always lets out a noise too. All the descriptions from eyewitnesses always lets out a noise. 3 different kinds of noises. Grido, shout. Strillo, more of a screech, I think. And urlo, which makes the walls shake. But he's always making this noise when he goes up. Something weird happening here. The sacraments always can send him into ecstasy, especially celebrating Mass. People in need of healing or conversion. On the left here, he's healing a nobleman, young nobleman who has gone insane. Grabs him by the hair and up they go. And it's a simultaneous healing and levitation. And here he is converting a Lutheran Saxon prince, Johann Friedrich. What he was doing in Assisi, which is where this happened. Why is this Lutheran Saxon prince in Assisi? Something's already going up. Anyway, he converted. And his family could do nothing about it. He could levitate alone, in solitude, or in public. And also, this is early on, when he was still a young man, rose above the head of Pope Urban VIII. And Urban VIII supposedly said, if this man dies before I do, I will testify at his canonization inquest I saw him fly. Okay, bringing this to a close. I know this is a long quote, but it's from a scholar who is very interested in dealing with impossible events, Jeffrey Kripal. He's at Rice University. He's actually their assistant dean of humanities. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard an otherwise admired colleague say something like, well, it doesn't really matter if Joseph of Cupertino flew up to the tree after a scream, or if Teresa of Avila floated off the floor as her sisters piled on top of her to avoid a social embarrassment. What matters is how the popular belief in such presumed levitations was disciplined, controlled, and maintained by the church, and later constructed as sanctity and as a saint. Really? I want to pull my hair out in such moments. A super pious Italian man ecstatically flies into a tree and has to be retrieved with a ladder, or a raptured Spanish nun can't keep herself on the floor in front of some visiting noblewomen, and these physical events do not matter to you? Excuse me? If either of those things actually happened, and our historical records suggest strongly that they did, such anomalous events change pretty much everything we thought we knew about human consciousness and its relationship to physics, gravity, material reality. Either single event would fundamentally change our entire order of knowledge, and you don't care? Don't you find that disinterest just a bit perverse? That disinterest has a name: functionalism. Functionalism. We professional scholars cannot investigate the event. We can only investigate what role the event plays in the formation of communities and discipline and so on and so forth. And we're all asked, by the way, those of us who work with these things, historians especially, we're asked to bracket the question. We have to bracket the question, did this really happen? So we have to bring our brackets with us and very carefully place them around the event. But there is levitation. My son lived in Japan for 2 years teaching English, and he rode levitating trains every day. We don't have them. We're too backwards over here in this continent, but yeah, other people have. So, the Communio Sanctorum, the communion of saints. This is my pitch for the Bollandists. Okay. What difference does it make for anybody to work on the lives of the saints or promote the knowledge and interest in the lives of the saints? I think this is one of the more fascinating aspects of not just Catholic piety and Catholic theology, but the Catholic intellectual tradition, which is that the community is not just those of us who are alive in the present, of thousands upon hundreds of thousands upon millions of fellow Christians, Catholics, who lived before us and were still the same church. And among those many, many who have departed are these very special people. These very special people who embody the very principles that we supposedly hold dear. They're very special. Yes, there are special people. In many ways, forget equity. No, these gifts are unevenly distributed throughout Christian history, but these people inspire not just heroic virtue, but belief in things we cannot see and touch, or that we can, in fact, see and touch and digest, like the Eucharist, which we are asked to believe is more than just, as a student said to our Catholic chaplain a few years ago at Yale, when he asked, "Do you know what the Eucharist is?" The student's response, "Yeah, it's that cookie we get." Sorry, it's more than a cookie wave. So, lives of the saints are more important than ever in a relentlessly presentist and materialist culture that disdains holiness, heroic virtue, and miracles, even the ridiculous ones. So there's your Library of the Impossible in Brussels. That's it, right? That's the one. Veritas et eruditio, truth and erudition. There, Saint Ignatius, I'm sure, is very eager to see the work of the Bollandists continue beyond the Acta Sanctorum to many other things, and especially now that, by the way, this new book I wrote, almost every text I used was digitized. Just remarkable. The older a text I needed, printed text, the more likely it was that it was digitized. What a future for all of this wonderful material. So, if you want to know more about the work of the Bollandists, this is a wonderful webinar that was held, I think, a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, maybe? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it was because of COVID, right? Yeah, it's beautiful. I know it's got a long URL, but just look up Lumen Christi Institute, Bollandists, and it'll bring you to the video. I'm not sure she ever read the Acta Sanctorum or the Analecta Bollandiana, but Flannery O'Connor, in a letter to Betty Hester, 1955, hit the nail on the head when she said, "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it." And unfortunately, this includes the fact that her name was removed from a building at Loyola, Baltimore, all for living in the 1950s and using language used in the 1950s. Thank you for your attention and patience. Now I'll take questions.
And maybe while you're thinking of questions, I want to point out that we have two people from the Bollandists here tonight. We have Father Mark Roster, who's president of the Bollandists, and Irinides Hansanen, who's the lifeblood of the organization and keeps it moving.
Yes, thank you so much. Super, super interesting and stimulating. One question I had is just, what does the, as if I understood you correctly, the paucity of medieval accounts of levitation, and then their apparent ubiquity, or at least greater frequency, post-medieval.
Yeah.
And then also the rise, you didn't mention this, but I was just thinking about, as I understand it, the rise of interest in and just whatever dabbling or belief in magic in this same time period. What does that do to Weber's disenchantment thesis?
Yeah, Weber has been under attack for quite some time from many different quarters. There's actually a very significant article written by Robert Scribner back in the early 80s. Incombustible Luther. And he deals with this Lutheran quote unquote superstition that texts written by Luther and images of Luther would not fly. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, actually, because one thing I didn't have time to cover is, and apropos of your question, the 17th century is the peak period for flying accounts in Western history, hands down, because it's not just good levitators that are out there, there are witches. So Halloween tomorrow. This is an asymmetry that has long puzzled. Protestants reject the concept that God would work miracles after the year 100. And they also reject much of Catholic theology, including Bollandists. But many of the early Protestant reformers and quite a good number of their followers accept medieval Catholic demonology 100%. And believe that, yes, people do bilocate, people do levitate. It's the devil.
Still violates law of nature.
Right, yeah. So I think in part the Catholic emphasis on miracles and levitation, and since levitation is a byproduct of mystical ecstasy is a response to the Protestant channel. To me, it seems quite obvious, like the causality. There's a causal factor. Matter of fact, I wrote an article title of which is Mysticism as Ecstasy of Polemic. Ecstasy as polemic. Look what we can do. And you can't do. So, yeah, what puzzled me more is the paucity of levitation Christians in the first 8-9 centuries. Because certainly before the world became Christian, there were levitators everywhere. And whenever I would mention this project to my colleagues who work in Asian religions, their response was usually, yeah, so what? Of course it's part of, yeah, it's part of Asian religions for centuries and centuries. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lecture and your work on this very important topic, and your most recent book, which I'm very much enjoying. And I have a question about something that you say in the book that you suggested just now, namely the way in which in the modern period, in the Reformation period, Protestants and Catholics didn't argue about whether these impossible events happen or not, but they argued about the nature of the causality, whether they're to be attributed to God and benevolent supernatural power, or to Satan and demonic power. And this was a very curious thing for me when I read your book. So I was just wondering, like, how do you account for the fact that it seems as if, to me at least, if I understand it correctly, that Protestants who say such things are attributing greater power to the demonic than to the divine, which seems counterintuitive given the, emphases on divine sovereignty and someone like Calvin and so forth.
Well,
So curious.
there's important footnote for that, which is that since Protestant reformers take on medieval demonology, they don't think that the devil has any power that's supernatural. What he has is a preternatural. And then there are two segments to this. His power is not supernatural, it's preternatural. What does that mean? It means he is so ancient, been around for so long, and he's so much smarter than humans, that basically he's like a modern scientist. And he doesn't break the laws of nature. He manipulates and tricks people into thinking that these are miracles. Calvin was saying that, right? They're not miracles, they're tricks, because he manipulates them. And the other part, the other segment is he has no power. Whatever he does is because God allows him to do it. So there's a weird, again, the asymmetry gets weirder the more you look at it, right? And to show you how perverse historians can be, my happiest moment in this project, I have been looking for a Protestant demonic meditation account. And was having trouble finding it. Aside from witchcraft trials. Oh yeah, which I saw a witch one. I found one here in Boston in 1693. And how did I find it? By reading a 19th century spiritualist journal, which led me to this account of a young girl here in Boston. Cotton Mather was involved. The Salem witch trials had just ended. Cotton Mather was in, and this girl was possessed. She was a teenage girl. No neighborhood getting, I don't know where. But he gathered several men. By one description, burly men. They tried to hold her down there. But she went, the burly men could not hold her. Nor could they pull her down from the ceiling. Just like Teresa, the description, you take out the names, and it's exactly the same. And then Cotton Mather asked these burly men, all of them, to sign affidavits. And the affidavits exist. And we can say, I was there, and this happened. 1693. So, what a happy day. Especially because the Spiritualist magazine had misspelled the name of the men who had signed the affidavits. So I had some trouble finding them. But, yeah, it's a weird thing. It's weird. I still can't make much sense of it. Yeah.
I have a couple things. First, our friends online are asking if you could stand near the microphone so
Oh,
they could hear your responses.
sure.
No worries.
Sorry.
My actual question is there any documentation or history on the role art played in the Bollandists scholarship, since there were so many depictions of saints and saints' lives, and did that influence them collecting their biographies?
I have seen photographs of images in the Bollandists library, right? They collect the images, but I don't know what role they have played. I really don't know the answer to that. But every scrap of evidence connected to the lives of the saints has been significant to their work. But I have yet to see, for instance, an art historian. There have been several exhibits of paintings of mystical ecstasy over the past 2 decades, and very nice, beautiful, expensive books published afterwards. But I have yet to see an art historian tackle this subject of what relationship exists between the lives of the saints and depictions of the mystical ecstasies and levitations and bilocations of saints. Yeah. Yes, in the back. Oh.
From the end of the 17th century, we started having illustrations. And in our library, we have a very important collection of paintings which have served to illustrate from the end of the 17th for about 100 years after. Now, many of the finds in the lives of the saints, and they are very important illustrations because many of the things depicted in them, they have disappeared. For instance, religions, which have disappeared during the revolution, have been destroyed. Others which have gone through alterations from what we see today to what they were. So if you're an artist or you're looking to really study them as they were, you should go back to the artisan forum and have a look. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'm curious, among all the possible miracles that you could have focused on, why you focused on levitation in particular. Was that given more importance than other miracles in the acta, or what are some of the other miracles that?
The reason I chose them, it's not because of what's in the acta or not in the acta sanctorum, but because these are two miracles that run so contrary to our present day understanding of the way nature works. Plus, there's this added factor. Many other miracles don't raise the same kinds of questions. And many other kinds of miracles associated with mystical ecstasy are very easy to fake. All right. So, for instance, healing miracles, they happen all the time. As a matter of fact, I think most miracles attributed to saints who've been canonized since the 19th century are healing miracles because they happen all the time. And what they look for at the Vatican are full-blown atheist scientists and doctors who can say, we can't explain this. This doesn't happen. So that can always be attributed to, again, that Augustinian principle. Oh, we don't yet know how this happens. Although some healing miracles are also beyond belief, including the only one I've been able to read about from a Vatican document, and it was for the canonization of Mary Elizabeth Seton. One of the miracles attributed to her was a young girl who was born deaf with absolutely no nerves in her ears. And she developed nerves, like about age 6, 7, or 8. And all the testimonies from these doctors say, this doesn't happen. This can't happen. Oh, they love that. Right? But levitation, especially, if it's outdoors, if it's indoors in a building with a very high ceiling, it's hard to fake, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Now we have magicians, or what do they call themselves now? Illusionists. Yeah, illusionists in Las Vegas who, levitate. But they've got ropes and pulleys and so on. And what I like about the levitations that I studied in the testimonies is that it would have been extremely difficult to fake. As a matter of fact, a good part of my book is about men and women who were considered living saints in their lifetime, but were proven to be frauds. Stigmata is very easy to fake. For instance, bilocation is a real puzzle because that's so much harder to pin down than levitation. I only found one case of someone who levitated such a short distance, bilocated such a short distance that people ran back and forth between point A and point B. Most bilocations are long distance. And pairing up those testimonies reminds me of, a case in court where they say, oh, it's a he said, she said kind of testimony. But basically things that are hard to fake and are really, really contrary to the laws of nature. Those two books I highlighted, Physical Phenomena of Mysticism, long list of miracles associated with mystical ecstasy. But most of them are, well, mind reading. Then there are some like the odor of sanctity. Those are harder to deal with. But again, I don't know. Regarding Saint Teresa of Avila, whose body refused to decompose and smelled wonderfully, one testimony said, yes, it was a wonderful odor, but it was so strong, it could give you a headache. And I was immediately reminded of any time I've stepped into an elevator with somebody who's wearing too much perfume, it can give you a headache. Yes, yeah, sure. But that was my reason for picking these two. Yes.
You sort of alluded to it a few times, but could you say more if you find the controversies around supernature and nature distinction in the way in which it influenced or didn't influence the Protestant mystics and ecstasy in particular? I think of Burma and Eire, who are explicitly referring back to the German.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They don't have this controversy that they had as science, natural science.
Right. And that's because, miracles come back to several branches of Protestantism too. So does mystical ecstasy. And I have a theory about this, not very well developed, that there's a certain substratum to human experience that humans share, regardless of culture, of certain things that we desperately, as human beings, desperately want to connect with. They can't be repressed for very long. They keep bouncing back. And I think this is when Jacob Boehme, Luther would have run him out of town. Calvin might have had him burned. But he was in a situation where things were more fluid and he could. And the same thing with, there was a radical contemporary of Luther and Calvin, Sebastian Frank, who was very much a mystic. But he actually rejected the Bible as the paper pope and said that Christian religion was all about personal one-on-one experience with the divine. And that was it. And anyone who had that one-on-one connection was a good Christian. And you didn't need a church, you didn't need a Bible. And somehow he survived. He worked as a soap maker most of the time, moving from city to city, and he was able to. But Pentecostalism in the Protestant tradition comes back, very strong. And I see some in this room are as old as I am, who might remember televangelists here in the United States healing people live on TV, Oral Roberts, and so on and so forth. He didn't believe in the cessation of miracles. But I have a colleague, friend, Ronald Ritkers, teaches at Duke. He's working now on Protestant mysticism. And he's found some very, very interesting ways in which even the most restrained kind of mysticism has, of course, parallels to Catholic mysticism. Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, so there were many limitations in late 16th, 17th century. Can you theorize why there seem to be fewer now? I don't really associate that with saints I know of 19th, 20th century. Are there cultural reasons, do you think?
The number of reports begin to shrink in the 18th century. But Alphonsus Liguori, for instance, is a very well-known 18th century levitator. But in the 20th century, we have Padre Pio, who not only levitated, but also bilocated and had the stigmata. He's the best known. I think there are a lot lesser known individuals, but the thing is that they perhaps are only known as levitators and bilocators by very small communities. Case in point, towards the end of my project, I found a French nun, born in 1901, died in 1951. So actually, I was born in 1950, so I could have been in the same room with her, except I wouldn't have known what was going on because I was less than a year old. But stigmata, levitation, bilocation, and extreme bilocation. Her name is Yvonne Aimée de Malestroit. And all the literature on her, all the printed literature is in French. None of it translated into English. It's actually a 5-volume hagiography. All in French, of course. She, we have reports of her bilocating to concentration camps and prisons. And even not just comforting people who were imprisoned, but helping them escape. And there's another side of her. She worked with the French resistance and also with downed Allied pilots, rescuing them, dressing them as nuns. And at the end of the war, she ended up getting 5 of the top medals awarded in France. And one of them was pinned on her by none other than Charles de Gaulle. And there's a photo of Charles de Gaulle pinning the medal on Sister Yvonne Aimée. She was taken in by the Gestapo and tortured by the Gestapo, but got out. And there's a report of her when she was in the Gestapo torture chambers, bilocating to her confessor in the Paris metro. And the station is mentioned too. I forget what station of the Paris metro. She appeared and said, please, please pray for me. You know, and somehow she got out. I'm only mentioning this, you know, in passing because I've barely just started to read about her. And I don't know all the details. But yeah, there are some. Padre Pio has been canonized. She has not, although there are many, many, many pushing for it. But I guess somebody was asking me this question before. Why is she not in the process? She's too much. She's just too much. That's what I've read in 3 different accounts, people explaining why her case has stalled, is that she's just too much. Yes, Mark.
Yeah. It's about the dignations. It's not about the whole branching, but it's about this limitation. You have shown 3 things. Also at the end, the big one.
Right.
Limitation of the dignations. Well, I have some remarks. First, Ignatius himself never spoke about that. Never. A Jesuit who lived during 2 years, in Rome with him and noticed every day what he saw, what he heard from Ignatius on Santos Camera. Now, one place, Ignatius react to a story that someone is telling to him about people. So, they're holy people, and because they are, I don't think there's levitation, but are very phenomenal. And Ignatius said, I'm very difficult to that. It's not because you are levitated or that or what, that you are a saint. You're a saint if you have followed Jesus Christ in your life. Okay, that's one thing. But I ask myself, is there not, I make not a big study on it, is there not a kind of structural element for Ignatius, this painting search, and I published one in one of my books also. They all are from after that. Ignatius are still to be canonized. So they will present him as other saints have been presented, levitation or other things. And to make sure that it happens really with Ignatius, they put like in the last thing, that's a very nice one. There was a man looking to you, and that's, I have other ones where also Ignatius is praying and he has some vision. He never spoke of the vision that he was visited by, but okay. And then also he's praying, and there are two Jesuits looking after the door, so that they can say, so we have seen it. And this is something that was made later on. He has one big difficult word, mystical word, is a spiritual diary. And there he never spoke about vision, but about I was visited by it. But then he does not describe how it was. And his, I think, his most profound mystical experience in that in this diary is when he says, I was introduced in the mystery of the Trinity. But there is no paintings of such, it does not say what, but he was, and for himself, so it was more an inner experience than something he saw. Yeah. Or that's just what I want to say about this levitation by Ignatius.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's one reason I didn't spend much time focusing on him, and it was precisely these, lapses between the record. Did you want to say?
Well, yeah, kind of a follow-up question that's related to this, which is that, it seems to me that, as you mentioned in your book, levitation, bilocation, these are all byproducts of mystical experience. And these mystics are people who, of course, have lived their whole life in sort of sensory perfection. Denial, but then doing the right things, married into image, launches into care, that sort of thing. But it also occurs to me that in all these accounts, I can't think of any that's an exception. This mystic is described as senseless. I also think maybe some connection with our own saying that person has lost his senses. It's all a little crazy. So it seems the gift of being perfect in your sensory perfection is senselessness. But the paradox is that there are witnesses who are doing the very empirical thing. So I think when we look to set this up, it was anti-Protestant, also against empiricism, doing the empirical thing of seeing. So is that what's happening? Two things are happening at once.
Oh yeah, I think definitely. You've got currents and countercurrents, and actually, those who would love to see the founder of any religion canonized would very desperately want this person to get promoted, not just in terms of heroic virtue, but also miracles. especially back in the 16th and 17th century, very much so. Yeah, you have to remain somewhat skeptical of all of these things. And I think it was you who pointed out to me that many of the miracles ascribed to Francis Xavier are only found in, is it Rigoneus?
Yeah, we're gonna narrow because, what was it, Torsolino in India, Teixeira in India was complaining that he never saw Francis Xavier raise anyone from the dead.
So we saw that painted.
Yeah.
So, yeah, these things can get exaggerated, and that cannot be discounted, and should not be discounted. But there are puzzles. And actually, Saint Ignatius died by stealth, right? At night. And they just found him dead, if I remember correctly, this is signified dead in water, which kind of goes against the grain of so many hagiographies. A good death, the example of the saintly lives of the perfect kind of death. He didn't get to do this. And what I don't know is I haven't found if anybody raised questions. Oh, this should not happen.
Well, Robert Ballard ends up being the opposite. That's how it doesn't pull with Larry and
Right.
all the rest of it becomes impossible for that by yourself.
I wouldn't say Ignatius saying that at the end of his life, he was always good at things, for Christ was always good thing.
Well, yeah, but we got to the subject because of the witness thing, right? But there are no witnesses to his death. Whereas in the lives of saints, contemporaries of Ignatius, it becomes very important in the hagiography to have a description of how wonderfully good the death was. But yeah, testimonies. What I like to say about testimonies is that, those are facts, and that we have hard facts. And then this is a term I get from William James. We have wild facts. It's a term that he liked to use a lot. Wild facts that just go against the grain of everything and just perplex people. And then we also have social facts. Ernst Troeltsch. Social fact. We all live with social facts. It's assumptions that no one dares to question, or that one can only question at a high price and govern people's behavior. So levitating and bilocating as a social fact, they're impossible. And the scholar I quoted at the end, Jeffrey Kripal, well, he's a very well-trained historian of religion from the University of Chicago. And he has this theory that actually the social facts determine the number of wild facts that occur. Because if it's a social fact that something can't happen, well, it's not likely to happen, which might also answer the question why we don't have as many levitators and bilocators in the 20th century. But I always tell, I once had a student at the University of Virginia who came to class high all the time. And ever since, I've been able to say to all my students, I said, first or second lecture, I can tell when you're high. But he would always laugh at the most inappropriate things. And one time somebody asked me a question about bilocation. This is years ago. And I said, yeah, bilocation, yeah. I've been wanting to do that for quite some time, but I'm not there yet. And boy, he thought that was the funniest thing. I'm not there yet. Oh, yeah, well, social fact. Okay. Oh, yeah.
If I could return to your comment that Ron Rittgers was investigating these Protestant forms of mysticism that were physically manifested. Because I think I remember Jonathan Edwards' wife levitated.
Yes.
And I guess I was curious to know, are there examples of bilocation in the Protestant tradition? Because I mean, I can think of Jonathan Edwards' wife as a levitator, but you know, how common was that? And
I
they
have
also have bilocation.
I have not run into a Protestant bilocator, but I read in text or in person. But I read the text that's used to attribute levitating to Sarah. Yeah, Edwards. Yeah, and it's ambiguous. It's ambiguous. But no, it does seem that she says there's no doubt about it. What's not ambiguous at all is that she is totally enraptured with Christ. Right. And there are passages like that in Jonathan Edwards too, where it's quite clear there's some very intense, emotional, mystical merging of self and the divine. Sarah Edwards's comments about feeling like she's going up, unclear, but it's possible. All sorts of strange things were happening then with the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, where I mean, after all, the Quakers and Shakers are called Quakers and Shakers for a reason, right? Is that they had physical phenomena. Yes.
Sorry, double dipping on questions, but just another comparison between medieval and early modern miracles. Can you comment on the relative frequency or paucity of Eucharistic miracles in early modernity? They were quite popular, obviously, in certain times of the Middle Ages.
That's a good question. But they continue to happen, but with less frequency. However, some are given a lot of attention.
Seems like in terms of Catholic Protestant, if you're trying to
Oh, yes.
shore up your doctrine, that might be the obvious.
As a matter of fact, one of the favorite relics of King Philip II of Spain was the Sagrada Forma. What was the Sagrada Forma? It was a consecrated host that had been stomped on by a Dutch iconoclast, and his heels had nails on them, right? And he stepped on it, and the nail marks produced blood. And the Sagrada Forma was kept at the Escorial in a very, very special, not just reliquary, but enclosure just for that reliquary. And it was used in several occasions to settle court disputes, court feuds. And actually, there's a very, very famous painting by, I forget the artist's name. It shows the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles II, Carlos II, piously praying before the Sagrada Forma, because that painting represents the healing of a court dispute. But there are many such damaged images and damaged hosts that became miraculous. But my favorite story of all has nothing to do with miracles, but a perceived miracle from a chronicle in Switzerland, a town where the images were destroyed. The images were distributed as firewood, the wooden ones. But someone was very upset that his neighbor was burning the images for firewood. So he did what any good Catholic would do. Went over, hollowed out a couple images and filled them with gunpowder. And the moral of the story was, when they blew up, the perceived miracle made this man reconvert back to Catholicism. So, yes,
One of our friends online just asked if the work of documenting miracles contested within the church and or by secular powers, as opposed to being contested between the church and the Protestant.
Oh, they were contested within the church. Oh, definitely. In my book, I've got a whole section on people who were considered living saints whose miracles were contested. And in only one of those cases was the person found not guilty. The rest were caught red-handed cheating. So yeah, they were contested for sure. Yeah. And that's what the devil's advocate position is all about. It's about contesting.
Well,
Okay.
thank you very much for this.
Thank you.